What if I told you that the most dangerous threat to a tyrannical empire wasn't rebellion, assassination, or foreign invasion? What if the real terror came from something far more insidious, the complete and deliberate erasure of the line between power and madness, between a ruler and the machinery of state itself? Today on Throne of Horrors, we're not just telling you about Caligula's infamous horse senator. We're exposing the dark psychological genius behind why he did it, and how this single act reveals a disturbing truth about power that most historians have completely missed. A truth that would repeat across centuries, in kingdoms, in dictatorships, and in the very systems we still live under today. Most people think Caligula was simply insane, the mad emperor who squandered the treasury, who murdered at whim, who made a horse a consul. But here's what the history books won't tell you, and this is where it gets genuinely horrifying. Caligula wasn't a madman who happened to have power. He was a master strategist using the appearance of madness as a weapon. He understood something that many rulers before and after him grasped only dimly, that when people believe their leader is unpredictable and irrational, they stop resisting, they stop organizing, they stop thinking about whether his actions make sense. They simply obey, because disobedience might be fatal, and there's no logic to appeal to. You can't reason with madness. The horse, incitatus, wasn't actually a joke at all. It was a statement. It was Caligula declaring to every senator in Rome, "Do you see this? I can elevate anyone or anything to power. Your status means nothing. Your bloodline means nothing. Your dignity means nothing. I can erase it all with a gesture." Every time a senator walked past that horse in its gold-trimmed stall, wearing its purple blanket, every time they heard rumors that Caligula had invited the horse to state dinners, and he did, they were receiving a message written in pure psychological terror. And that was precisely the point. But here's the twist that most historians ignore entirely. Caligula didn't invent this tactic, and he certainly didn't end it. What he was doing, what so many of history's darkest figures did, was exploiting a fundamental vulnerability in how human hierarchies work. We believe that status matters because we agree it matters. It's a shared illusion. The moment a ruler demonstrates that they can grant status to literally anything, to any object, to any creature, they've shattered that illusion. And when the illusion breaks, panic follows. Panic makes people compliant. Consider the case of Emperor Elagabal, who ruled Rome nearly a century after Caligula. Elagabal declared that he was a woman, and demanded to be called by female names and pronouns. He married and divorced men multiple times, offered rewards to physicians who could provide him with certain anatomical modifications. Rather than seeing this as a personal choice, a transgressive one certainly by Roman standards, his court and the Senate were forced to navigate an entirely unstable reality, where the most basic facts about their leader seemed negotiable, surreal, fundamentally wrong. The effect was paralyzing. You couldn't even build a conspiracy against him on logical ground because the logical ground kept shifting beneath your feet. Then there's the case of King Charles VI of France, the Mad King, who believed he was made of glass. And I mean truly believed this. He had iron rods inserted into his clothing to prevent himself from shattering. He would scream if anyone came near him. He commissioned suits made from reinforced materials to protect his fragile glass body. His court had to reorganize around this delusion. The entire machinery of state had to accommodate the irrational belief system of a single man. And what's chilling is this. Most people couldn't openly mock him, couldn't organize against him, couldn't even admit to themselves that the king had lost his mind, because to do so would be to undermine the entire legitimacy of the crown itself. This is the pattern that gets buried in history. Madness, when wielded by someone with absolute power, becomes a weapon more effective than any sword or poison. It becomes a way of controlling reality itself. Because once your subjects accept that their ruler operates on a different plane of logic, that the normal rules don't apply to him, that he might feed you to eels at a state dinner simply because the sunset was the wrong shade of orange, then they'll accept anything, anything at all. And that's exactly what Caligula did. The feeding of enemies to eels wasn't just execution. It was theater. It was psychological demolition, because an execution makes sense. There's a logic to it. But feeding someone to eels, choosing that specific death, it speaks of a mind that operates beyond comprehension, beyond mercy, beyond reason. His enemies didn't just die. they were unmade, erased not just from life, but from the very fabric of rational discourse. How do you organize a rebellion against someone like that? How do you even predict what they'll do next? The brilliance, and I say this with genuine historical appreciation, was that Caligula seemed to understand human psychology at a level that wouldn't be formally studied until centuries later. He knew that uncertainty is paralyzing. He knew that if you eliminate the predictability of power, you eliminate the possibility of effective resistance. A tyrant who acts according to understandable motives can be resisted, can be predicted, can be overthrown by those who understand his logic. But a ruler who appears genuinely mad, whose actions seem to defy all rational motivation, he becomes untouchable. Now this raises a deeply uncomfortable historical question that most documentaries skip entirely. How much of the madness was actual mental illness, and how much was calculated performance? With Caligula, we'll probably never know for certain. The historical sources we have were written by people who survived him, people who had reasons to exaggerate his cruelty and instability. But here's what matters for our purposes. Intent becomes almost irrelevant. Whether Caligula was genuinely experiencing a break with reality, or whether he was masterfully performing one, the result was identical. Rome became a place where anything could happen, where power operated without rules, and where the only safe option was absolute obedience. This pattern repeats through history in genuinely disturbing ways. Ivan the Terrible of Russia, and yes, the Terrible was literally part of his name, created what became known as the oprichnina, a secret police force loyal only to him. He would dress them in black cloaks and have them ride black horses through the streets. Any property they wanted became theirs. Anyone they killed was disappeared. But Ivan didn't just create a secret police. He created an entire theater of terror, where the rules of civilization temporarily ceased to exist. And the genius of it was that nobody was safe. Not nobles, not clergy, not his own advisors. His own son was executed, possibly by Ivan's own hand during a rage. The entire kingdom existed in a state of perpetual, rational fear of an irrational force. You see it again with King Henry the Fowens of England. Henry married 6 times, divorced 2, had 2 executed, 1 died in childbirth, and remarried the last before she could even conceive. Each marriage came with palace intrigue, betrayals, and executions. His courtiers existed in a state of perpetual uncertainty about whether they would wake up the next morning alive. A casual remark that Henry overheard could mean your death. A whisper that his new wife spoke to you with too much warmth could send you to the executioner. The court developed entire systems of reading Henry's moods, analyzing his silences, trying to predict his whims. But ultimately, it was all guesswork. Henry was unpredictable not because he was insane, but because he had the power to be unpredictable without consequence. And yet the truly horrifying part of this history is this: it worked. These kingdoms didn't collapse because of the madness of their rulers. In fact, many of them flourished. Rome under Caligula remained a superpower. Russia under Ivan the Terrible expanded its territory. England under Henry V became increasingly centralized and powerful. The apparatus of state, the bureaucracy, the military, the infrastructure continued to function because it was designed to function regardless of whether the person at the top was rational or not. This is what the history textbooks really don't want to tell you, because it suggests something deeply unsettling about power itself. It suggests that perhaps the system of absolute authority doesn't require wisdom at the top. Perhaps it even works better when the person with absolute power is unpredictable, because then everyone else becomes invested in maintaining the structures of authority. They can't overthrow the king if they don't know what he'll do next. They can't organize without knowing whether their co-conspirators will betray them at the slightest sign of disloyalty. The apparatus becomes self-sustaining through pure psychological terror. Caligula's horse senator was therefore not an aberration, not a sign of a system failing. It was a sign of a system working exactly as designed. A system where power operates not through consent but through control, not through understanding but through confusion. The horse wasn't a senator because Caligula was mad. The horse was a senator because making something senseless into law is the ultimate assertion of authority. It says, I don't need your approval. I don't even need you to understand. I just need your obedience. And when we examine the feeding of enemies to eels, we see the same principle. It wasn't cruelty for its own sake, or rather, It was cruelty as a system of communication. Every eunuch, every advisor, every senator who heard about this specific death understood that they were not dealing with a leader who could be negotiated with, reasoned with, or predicted. They were dealing with someone whose thought processes operated on an entirely different plane, and that realization that the rules of normal human behavior don't apply to your ruler is psychologically devastating in ways that conventional execution never could be. What's truly, genuinely dark about all of this is that these rulers understood something that modern psychology confirms. Uncertainty is more paralyzing than pain. A person can endure physical torture if they understand why they're being tortured. They can organize mentally, prepare themselves, even find meaning in suffering. But a person who lives under the constant threat of unpredictable, inexplicable punishment, a person who cannot even construct a narrative that makes sense of their oppression, that person breaks in ways that are almost irreversible. Caligula's Rome wasn't a kingdom drowning in chaos. It was a kingdom functioning perfectly under the assumption that its ruler was fundamentally unstable. The senators still met, laws were still made, taxes were still collected, trade still happened. The empire didn't fall because Caligula made his horse a senator. It continued exactly as before, just now with the horse sitting in the Senate chamber as a permanent visual reminder that authority doesn't answer to logic. This is why I need to tell you something crucial for understanding not just Caligula, but the entire dark pattern of human history. The real horror isn't the madness itself. The real horror is how efficiently it can be weaponized and how reluctant people are to recognize it when it happens. Because admitting that your ruler is mad, unpredictable, and dangerous requires you to also admit that the entire system holding you in place might be fundamentally broken, and that admission can cost you your life. So when history shows us Caligula making his horse a senator, when it tells us he fed his enemies to eels, when it describes his increasingly bizarre and cruel acts, most historians treat these as examples of his descent into madness. But what if we're looking at it wrong? What if these acts were precisely calculated to maintain the most absolute, most unquestionable, most psychologically suffocating control ever achieved in human history? What if the genius of Caligula, the thing that made him truly dangerous, wasn't that he was mad, but that he made everyone around him behave as if he were, and they never stopped, not for the entire duration of his reign? Now, if you want to dig deeper into the psychological mechanics of how power actually works when it escapes the bounds of rationality, how entire societies reorganize themselves around the unpredictability of a single individual, I've put together a comprehensive guide exploring the hidden patterns in history's darkest rulers. You'll find it linked in the description and pinned in the comments. It covers not just Caligula, but every empire where this same pattern emerged, and the specific warning signs that show when a system of authority is beginning to weaponize irrationality. Because understanding this isn't just academic. It's a pattern that repeats, and recognizing it might be the only way to protect yourself when it does. The truth is that history doesn't show us the rise and fall of madness. It shows us something far more disturbing: the systematic exploitation of psychological vulnerability at the largest possible scale. It shows us that power doesn't require the person wielding it to be rational, wise, or even capable of genuine leadership. Power only requires the absolute willingness to make everyone around you believe that anything is possible, that everything is at stake, and that obedience is the only survival strategy available. And that, perhaps more than any eels, any poison, any blade, is the real engine of tyranny. But here's where the story gets darker still. Because Caligula wasn't unique. He wasn't even the most effective at this particular horror. History's most devastating despots understood something that ordinary, brutal rulers never grasped: that calculated madness, the deliberate, strategic blurring of the line between reason and chaos, was far more useful than simple competence. Consider Vlad III, called Vlad the Impaler, who ruled Wallachia in the 15th century. Vlad inherited a fractured, unstable kingdom surrounded by larger, more powerful empires waiting for any sign of weakness to strike. He faced an existential threat: the Ottoman Empire to the south, Hungarian kingdoms to the north, and within his own borders, the boyars, the aristocratic class that had destabilized his father's reign and murdered his older brother. Most rulers facing this pressure would attempt diplomacy, strategic alliances, careful negotiation. Vlad chose something far more calculated. He began systematically impaling his enemies, not as a random act of violence, but as a deliberate communication strategy. The boyars who threatened his power, impaled. Ottoman emissaries who demanded tribute, he impaled them. Merchants who didn't contribute to his treasury, impaled. The numbers are staggering. Contemporary accounts suggest he impaled as many as 20,000 people during his reign, creating entire forests of stakes driven through human bodies, left to decompose in open fields where anyone traveling through Wallachia would encounter them. But here's the critical insight. Vlad wasn't doing this because he enjoyed inflicting pain. He was doing this because it worked. The Ottoman Empire, which had expected to annex Wallachia with minimal resistance, instead withdrew. They literally turned around when they encountered the forests of impaled bodies. Vlad's own boyars, terrified into absolute submission, stopped rebelling. His kingdom, previously fractured and vulnerable, became militarily stable for the first time in a generation. He had weaponized horror as a foreign policy. And this is where the psychology becomes genuinely disturbing. Because Vlad's success wasn't despite his extreme brutality, it was because of it. In a world where conventional military strategy wouldn't have saved him, where diplomacy would have been interpreted as weakness, where any appearance of hesitation would have been fatal, the deliberate cultivation of a reputation for incomprehensible, unstoppable violence became his greatest asset. He wasn't mad. He was strategically creating the appearance of madness to terrify his enemies into submission, and his subjects into absolute obedience. This pattern appears again and again across history, but nowhere more systematically than in the reign of Ivan IV of Russia, called Ivan the Terrible. Ivan inherited the Russian throne at 3 years old and watched as the boyars, the same aristocratic class that had plagued earlier Russian rulers, essentially held him prisoner while they plundered the state treasury and murdered anyone who challenged their power. He watched his mother, Elena Glinskaya, poisoned when he was 8 years old. He watched his advisors and mentors murdered. He was left essentially as a figurehead in his own kingdom. When Ivan came of age and took actual control of power, he made a decision that would reshape his entire reign. He moved against the boyar class with methodical, calculated devastation. But unlike Vlad, Ivan didn't just impale people and leave them in fields. He created an entire apparatus of terror, the oprichnina, which translates roughly as the separate domain, but functioned as something far darker. A secret police force dressed in all black, riding black horses with a dog's head mounted on their saddles as a symbol of their purpose, to hunt down and destroy the enemies of the Tsar. The oprichnina members weren't random thugs. They were chosen for their psychological capacity to implement violence without question or hesitation, and they conducted their campaigns with a precision that was almost bureaucratic. They would arrive in a town, systematically execute anyone suspected of disloyalty, confiscate their property, and move on to the next location. Entire families were murdered. Entire communities were erased. And unlike Vlad, Ivan didn't leave the bodies displayed as a warning. Instead, he ensured that the uncertainty itself became the terror. Nobody knew who would be targeted next. No amount of loyalty guaranteed safety. The only way to survive was to become so thoroughly submissive, so utterly devoted to the Tsar's will, that any independent thought became literally unthinkable. This is where the madness and the calculation become almost indistinguishable, because Ivan's terror was so systematic, so pervasive, that it began to function as a form of collective psychology. The constant threat, the absolute unpredictability of who would be executed next, created a state of learned helplessness in the population. People stopped trying to predict what the Tsar wanted because prediction became impossible. They simply obeyed, reflexively, hoping that compliance would protect them even though they knew it might not. And Ivan, watching this transformation, understood perfectly what was happening. His reputation for extreme cruelty, for executing advisors on whims, for poisoning family members, for conducting campaigns of terror that seemed to serve no strategic purpose, became his tool for absolute control. When people believed you might do anything, when your rationality became genuinely questionable, when the possibility of your own destruction became a real and ever-present danger in your presence, obedience stops being a choice. It becomes the only available survival strategy. Now, what makes this psychologically sophisticated is that Ivan didn't maintain this level of terror through pure force alone. Force, you see, requires constant resources. You need soldiers, you need executioners, you need the infrastructure to carry out threats. But once you've established a reputation for unpredictable, absolute cruelty, the terror becomes self-sustaining. People police themselves. They spy on each other out of fear. They report dissent before it can form. They internalize the terror so completely that you barely need to execute anyone anymore. The fear of execution becomes more effective than execution itself. And this is precisely where we encounter one of history's most brutal insights, that in situations of genuine instability, where a ruler faces real threats, where there is genuine chaos threatening the state, the appearance of madness can actually be more stabilizing than rational governance. Because rational governance requires convincing people to accept difficult sacrifices for long-term benefit. Calculated madness requires only that they fear the alternative more. Ivan's reign lasted over 50 years. He conquered vast territories, stabilized his kingdom, expanded Russian power, and died in his bed, which for a medieval despot was an extraordinarily rare outcome. By any measure of survival and consolidation of power, his strategies worked. He took a kingdom that was being picked apart by internal factions and external enemies, and through a calculated campaign of terror, transformed it into a unified, defensible state under absolute central control. But, and this is crucial, the cost was staggering. Estimates suggest that Ivan's terror campaign killed somewhere between 4,000 and 60,000 people, depending on whose accounts you believe. Entire regions were depopulated. Families were eradicated. The psychological damage to the population persisted for generations. The cultural scars from Ivan's reign lasted for centuries. And here's what historians often overlook. Ivan didn't just kill people. He fundamentally altered how Russians understood power itself. After Ivan, authority in Russia wasn't about consensus, or even legitimacy in the Western sense. It was about dominance. Raw, unquestionable, terror-backed dominance. The precedent he set echoed through centuries of Russian autocracy, from his successors to the Romanovs to Stalin himself. Each subsequent tyrant looked back at Ivan's methods and thought, "This works. This is how you consolidate absolute power." The machinery of fear that Ivan constructed became the blueprint for oppression in Russia. His secret police, the oprichnina, those black-cloaked enforcers, weren't just thugs. They were the first institutionalized terror apparatus in European history, and they worked. They eliminated opposition. They silenced dissent. They made people afraid to even speak against the Tsar. But power gained through terror is power built on quicksand. The moment the tyrant weakens, the system collapses. And that's exactly what happened after Ivan's death. His son, Fyodor, mentally unstable and utterly unprepared, inherited a state held together by nothing but fear of his father's ghost. Within a generation, Russia descended into chaos. The time of troubles, they called it. Civil war, foreign invasion, starvation, anarchy. Everything Ivan had built through decades of systematic brutality unraveled in less than 20 years. This is the bitter irony of tyranny. The more perfectly you enforce control through terror, the less stable that control actually becomes. Ivan created a state where no one trusted anyone, where loyalty meant nothing, only fear mattered, where innovation was impossible because any deviation from the Tsar's will meant death. He built a machine so efficient at crushing opposition that it had no capacity for adaptation, compromise, or evolution. What makes Ivan's reign so historically significant and so terrifying is that he achieved his political objectives while simultaneously poisoning the very foundation of the state he created. He proved you could consolidate power through systematic terror. He also proved that such power was hollow at its core. It couldn't be inherited, it couldn't adapt, it couldn't survive without continuous application of violence. The other rulers who studied Ivan's methods, and there were many, learned only half the lesson. They learned the first part, how to wield terror. They didn't internalize the second part, that terror eventually consumes itself. They repeated his mistakes across centuries. In Russia, in Europe, in the Middle East, in Asia, tyrants looked at Ivan the Terrible and saw success. They didn't see the time of troubles waiting at the end. Now, what separates Ivan from other brutal rulers of his era is the scale and the systematic nature of his violence. Across Europe, in the Ottoman Empire, in China and Japan, there were tyrants. Vicious, cruel men who killed to consolidate power, but most of them operated within some kind of framework. Religious law, feudal tradition, codes of honor, however twisted, Ivan abandoned all pretense. He declared himself above law, above tradition, above God's judgment. He created a state where the ruler's will was the only law. This is crucial to understanding why Ivan became legendary. Not just in Russia, but across the world. He didn't conquer more territory than Alexander the Great. He didn't establish a civilization that lasted 1,000 years like Rome, but he created a new model of absolute power, power completely divorced from tradition, legitimacy, or any restraining force. Power that answered to nothing but itself. Later rulers in Russia, and indeed across the world, would claim they were following Ivan's example when they pursued authoritarian control. And they were right, but they were also repeating his mistakes. They didn't understand that Ivan's terror was effective precisely because it was unprecedented. He broke the system so completely that people had no framework for resistance. Once the precedent existed, once people understood that a czar could do these things, the terror became less effective. Anticipation replaced shock. Resistance became possible. And yet, despite the ultimate failure of his dynasty, despite the chaos that followed his death, Ivan's legacy persisted. Russian autocracy never entirely abandoned the model he created. The idea that absolute power, divorced from law or tradition, could be justified, that idea endured. It shaped Russian political culture for the next 500 years. It influenced how subsequent rulers thought about control, about opposition, about the relationship between ruler and ruled. The fascinating and disturbing truth is that Ivan the Terrible was both a catastrophic failure and a complete success, depending on your time frame. In the short term, his lifetime, the immediate decades after, he succeeded brilliantly. He consolidated power. He unified Russia. He created a centralized state. He defended against foreign invasion. By any measure of political effectiveness, his strategies worked. In the long term, the centuries that followed, his methods proved unsustainable. They worked so well at destroying the old system that they left nothing stable in place. And the subsequent rulers who tried to replicate his success, without understanding why it had worked, created even greater disasters. They had the terror without the necessity, the brutality without the justification. They simply became tyrants without purpose. What we see in Ivan is perhaps the most extreme case of a pattern that repeats throughout history, the tyrant who believes he is necessary. Ivan genuinely thought, or at least convinced himself, that his terror was essential to save Russia, that without his brutality, the kingdom would be devoured by external enemies and internal chaos. And he had evidence. Russia had been weak, it had been invaded, it had been fragmented. His methods did address those problems. They worked. The trap he fell into, and it's a trap that has caught countless rulers, is believing that what is necessary becomes what is right, that efficacy equals justification, that because terror worked, it was therefore justified. But this logic is fundamentally flawed. It's the reasoning of a tyrant who has lost the ability to distinguish between power and righteousness. And here's where the story takes a turn that most historians gloss over. Because Ivan's reign didn't end with a dramatic execution or a merciful death. It ended with something far more unsettling, a slow, agonizing dissolution into irrelevance. The man who had terrorized an entire empire, who had murdered thousands with his own hands, who had built a state through fear, gradually lost the ability to control even himself. In his final years, Ivan retreated into increasingly bizarre behavior. He would wear monk's robes one day, then demand execution the next. He'd order feasts for his victims' families, then have them arrested mid-meal. He created an imaginary kingdom within his own palace, complete with fake ceremonies and phantom officials. His mind, perhaps broken by decades of unchecked power and the weight of his own atrocities, began to fragment. Reality and delusion merged. The oprichnina, that terrifying secret police force, began to turn on itself. Without Ivan's direct oversight, regional commanders started using their positions for personal wealth and revenge rather than state security. The organization that was supposed to protect the throne had become a tool of corruption. Ivan, sensing this betrayal, did what he always did. He killed. He executed oprichnina leaders by the dozens. He disbanded the entire organization in a fit of paranoid rage, then immediately realized he'd removed the very instrument of control that kept him in power. By the time Ivan's health truly failed, around 1584, he was a shadow of the tyrant he'd once been. His physicians, terrified of him still, even in his weakness, administered mercury treatments that likely accelerated his decline. Whether those treatments were administered out of fear that Ivan might punish them for insufficient care, or out of a subtle wish to hasten his death, history doesn't record. Perhaps both were true. Ivan died on March 18, 1584. The records are unclear about the exact cause. Some say a stroke, others report a sudden collapse during a game of chess. What we know is that the man who had redefined power through terror, who had consolidated Russia into a continental empire, who had personally murdered his own son and countless thousands, ended his life in a palace, surrounded by courtiers who feared him still, though he could barely move. His body was entombed in the Archangel Cathedral in Moscow, but here's the detail that haunts historians even today. When his tomb was opened in the 20th century for examination, investigators found an unusual substance in his remains, high concentrations of mercury. This sparked decades of debate. Had his physicians poisoned him? Or was it just the treatment they used? The truth died with Ivan, buried beneath centuries of Russian history. But the real legacy of Ivan the Terrible extends far beyond his death. He had fundamentally changed how power worked in Russia. He'd proven that a single man, backed by terror and a secret police apparatus, could reshape an entire civilization. He'd shown that brutality, when systematic and relentless, could be more effective than mercy or negotiation. And countless rulers after him took that lesson to heart. The Oprichnina model would be replicated, adapted, and refined by every tyrant that followed. Stalin's secret police didn't invent totalitarian control. They were reading from a script Ivan had written 4 centuries earlier. The idea that a state could be held together through fear, through an apparatus of surveillance and execution, through the absolute power of one man to decide life and death without limitation or accountability, this became the dark blueprint for the 20th century's worst regimes. And perhaps that's the most terrifying aspect of Ivan's story. He wasn't unique. He wasn't an anomaly. He was, in many ways, the perfect expression of what happens when absolute power is granted to a man without absolute restraint. History is littered with variations on his theme. Different names, different centuries, different continents, but the same fundamental pattern. A leader rises to power. He consolidates control through terror. He believes his methods are justified by results. And he builds a system that outlasts him, a system that subsequent rulers inherit and refine. Now, if you want to understand the complete psychological breakdown of Ivan, the specific paranoia, the neurological deterioration, and how it shaped his final acts, we've created an in-depth guide in the description and pinned comment. It dives deep into the medical and psychological records that historians have pieced together over centuries. It's the kind of material that shows just how complex and disturbing the human capacity for tyranny really is. What makes Ivan's story so enduring, so relevant even to modern ears, is that it forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. We want to believe that tyranny comes from truly evil people, monsters who are fundamentally different from us. But Ivan was human. He had logic, however twisted. He had motivations, however corrupt. He had a vision for his nation, however catastrophic the cost. He wasn't evil in the cartoonish sense. He was something far more unsettling. He was a man who convinced himself that his cruelty was necessary. Every subsequent tyrant in history has used some version of this justification. Every regime built on terror has claimed it was necessary for stability. Every dictator has pointed to external threats or internal chaos to justify the elimination of dissent and the consolidation of absolute control. And many of them have succeeded, at least in the short term. They've actually made their nations more organized, more militaristically powerful, more unified, at the cost of millions of lives and the complete destruction of human dignity. Ivan the Terrible proved that this model works. And that's the real horror. Not that he was uniquely evil, but that his methods were effective. Not that he was uniquely insane, but that his logic was internally coherent. A man can genuinely believe he's saving his nation while murdering thousands. A leader can systematically destroy human beings and still sleep at night, believing he's done what was necessary. The question we're left with, the one that haunts historians and should haunt us all, is this: if those methods work, if consolidating power through terror actually does create stability and strength, even if only temporarily, how do we guard against it? How do we prevent the next Ivan? Because power has never asked permission before taking the throne, and terror has never needed justification when it produces results. The history of tyranny is not a warning from another world. It's a warning from our own world, from people just as human as we are, making choices just as rational as ours can be, arriving at horror through logic. And if you want to fully explore the psychological mechanisms that allow men to commit atrocities while maintaining a clear conscience, the complete guide is available through the pinned comment and in the description. It goes into the neurological evidence, the documented testimonies, and the private writings that reveal how Ivan's mind actually worked. Thank you for descending into this darkness with us. Ivan's story is one that historians often sanitize, reducing it to political intrigue or military conquest. But the truth is far darker. It's about the human capacity for justifying the unjustifiable, for making horror rational, for building empires on bone and blood. If you found this exploration of history's darkest corners compelling, please subscribe to Throne of Horrors so you never miss our weekly deep dives into the forgotten horrors of civilization. Hit that notification bell and let us know in the comments which historical atrocity haunts you most. We'll be back soon with even darker truths. Thank you for watching.